Can't
Pastor Lou was wondering if you were coming, so he was off pushing more buttons. So
Sorry we were late.
Oh, okay.
I know you're often looking for us, and then we're sitting here talking, and I haven't turned it on yet. So how are you, Colette?
I'm not totally adjusted to at my church at 1 and taking my phone and
we're losing you. You're breaking up.
I don't know what to that.
Did you get a new phone?
Well, no, I have a 7N.
Right.
And losing phone calls. So they said because hours were not.
Yeah, I've been having that. I'm going to Verizon tomorrow. I'm having that problem. I don't get them, and I don't get connection. So I know after a while it happens, but we're getting like every other word from you. So hopefully we'll understand your words of wisdom.
If I turn the phone the other, I'm talking to you on my new phone.
Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay, I know, but the microphone is on the end that I had stuck into the holder.
Okay.
It's working better now.
Now we can hear you.
Yes.
We're
All right.
Isaiah 52.
Yeah, so we're about ready to start to read. Good morning to those of you who are watching online, joining us for this Wednesday morning reading. We're reading and continuing to read through Isaiah, and we'll see what Isaiah has to say for us into our world today. Barbara's going to read.
Okay. Awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion, put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city, for the uncircumcised and the unclean shall enter you no more. Shake yourself from the dust, rise up, O captive Jerusalem. Loose the bonds from your neck, O captive daughter Zion. For thus says the Lord, you were sold for nothing, and you shall be redeemed without money. For thus says the Lord God, long ago my people went down into Egypt to reside there as aliens. The Assyrian, too, has oppressed them without cause. Now therefore, what am I doing here, says the Lord, seeing that my people are taken away without cause? Their rulers howl, says the Lord, and continually all day long my name is despised. Therefore my people shall know my name. Therefore in that day they shall know that it is I who speak. Here am I. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Listen, your sentinels lift up their voices. Together they sing for joy. For in plain sight they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Break forth together into singing, you ruins of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. Depart, depart, go out from there. Touch no unclean thing. Go out from the midst of it. Purify yourselves. you who carry the vessels of the Lord. For you shall not go out in haste, and you shall not go in flight. For the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortal. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate.
Okay. So beautiful imagery of that which was abused and beaten and dead and neglected and cast aside, now moving back to the center of history. Being released, it makes me wonder what was going on physically in the world. Babylon is done, and its oppression against not just the Israelites, but the whole community of people is over. I don't know what has happened that has crippled them, but they are unable to contain them, and there's a mass exodus taking place. It has similarities in description to Egypt. There's some nuances of the remembrance of Egypt here, but when the Israelites left Egypt, they took everything Egypt had. They took the spoils of Egypt with them, and they took the food and the livestock and everything. It was how they lived in the wilderness. They lived off the spoils of Egypt. This is different in that the word from God says, don't touch anything. Don't take anything with you. You go without any resources. Just get out. And then in the last paragraph, this sort of, I don't know what to call it, it's personification of Israel as one human being. And so, my servant shall prosper. He, one male pronoun to summarize all the people. He will be lifted up and shall be very high, just as there were many who were astonished at him. Now, this language about so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, in the first century, the people who read these scriptures in synagogue saw Jesus here. They saw Jesus in his demoralized and effaced form hanging on the cross. And so what they said was, this is that. This is that, because my servant was intended to be the whole population of the people, unrecognizable as a people of God, unrecognizable in any of the original idea, which was, you walk with me, I'll walk with you, and I will bless those that bless you, and together we will bless the families of the earth. There's no way you could see captive Israel as living out their blessing. They were demoralized. They had been taken into captivity, and ultimately the evaluators of the time, like Isaiah and others, say, why did this happen? It happened because you lost entirely your entire reason for existence. You lost it. And the consequences of your way of life, turning to greed and selfishness and all the things that are the opposite of the way of God who made the world, has come to bear on your life, and you're destroyed. You've destroyed yourselves. But there's a theological language that says Babylon has carried out that destruction.
Gotta put the blame on somebody else, not ourselves, right?
Yeah, and maybe that's, what the voice of Isaiah is supposed to be saying is, okay, yeah, you I don't know, I can quickly think of little tiny examples. You know, if you're going to go out drinking every night and you're going to get drunk and you're going to come home and then on the way home, you know, you run a traffic light and get smashed and hurt and end up in the hospital, and you can lay there and in your illness you can blame the truck driver who hit you. You know, like, and the prophets come along to say, no, look, you destroyed your life. You've lived in a way that is contrary to all the structures and the foundations of life. And you knew it. You had good reason to know it. You've come from a tradition of knowing that the God of the universe is concerned for justice and generosity and hospitality, and you lived as if you did not know God. Now, I don't know what else to use except Isaiah's language is the punishment is being lifted. You know, and that's how he refers to it, as the punishment. But along the way, as this suffering servant image arrives, and that is, now Israel is suffering, the theologians begin to rework it, and they begin to think that, you know, this is now the way God is going to save the world, through their suffering, through their rising up as people now. Hopefully now they've learned their lesson, right? Now they'll finally get back to the mission of blessing. But here, this idea of my servant, Israel is the servant of God, created for serving. And now, who can recognize them? They were astonished at the look of this. Like, if you were the servant of the Most High God, wouldn't you be dressed in regal robes and, you know, have important people driving you around? You know? And instead, they're just a meager band of peasants and beaten, and their condition is startling. And it says, he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told them they shall see, and at that which they had not heard they shall contemplate. Again, in the first century, the awful experience of the crucifixion of Jesus. I mean, whatever you make of the claims for resurrection or any of the rest of it, the days of Jesus' crucifixion were horrifying. They were experiences of, you know, just look what happened. And look what happened to the one who was supposed to be the favored child of God. So you begin to hear a lot of these verses get quoted when they start to tell the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. And it gets more plain, like as we read on, and I think we should, you'll see even more of the language, like in Handel's Messiah. You know, a lot of these were lifted out as people would call them prophecies. I don't think in mind and heart of Isaiah was there ever an image of Jesus. I don't think he was not a fortune teller. But what happened is it worked the other way around. They saw what happened to Jesus, and they saw what was happening to the disciples in their torture and beating, and they went back and they heard an echo of this experience, and the language of this experience rang true for them. I don't know if this gets us out of that thing we get into all the time in terms of whether God is actually, you know, has God punished these people? You know, is that the way God works?
No, not in my mind. And the situation happened that they were in bad shape, but I also think that in terms of when you're talking about comparing it to Jesus, it's the recognition that people of God do not necessarily have to be the regal and the royalty, and that if you recognize me in the least of my these, you know, kind of thing, you know, I guess I keep thinking of Mother Teresa, or people, St. Francis, or people who lived among the poor and, you know, did not live it up and were not successful as the most people consider success, but yet they were doing God's work and they were, you know, following it, so that we need to recognize that, you know, the prosperity gospel comes to mind, and I don't, you know, agree with that if I do everything God's way, that I will be rewarded in some monetary way at all.
Yeah, because the rewards of, in some ways, this is becoming clearer to me now as we go through this. I do believe in the promise that if you hook on your life on the train of God's call to mission and love and caring, you will be blessed.
Absolutely.
You will experience blessing upon blessing.
But it's not financial blessing.
No. And it may not be visible to anybody else. It may, look at Jesus. Jesus, again, this is, all of theology comes together in this understanding of what happened to Jesus. Because Jesus' report of his own life was, like, I'm the wealthiest man in the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because I have this relationship to God, and it leads me. I mean, he was courageous in standing up against the oppression even of the rich Jewish leaders. He went to the poor. He went to the lepers. He ministered to women in particular. But did he receive, you know, he didn't get elected emperor or king. In fact, Pilate says to him, "Are you a king?" He says, "Look, I know there's a whole bunch of people out there that tell you they want to put a crown on my head, but I have a feeling that it's not genuine." But then the Christian theologians come along and they see he died, he suffered and died. But that they have this language of, but God rewarded him and put him at God's very own right hand. So the rewards are not, I don't know, they're the reward of a life worth living. Right?
Absolutely.
And of course,
what is the purpose of life? You're getting, you know, what is God's purpose? What is our purpose in life? Is it to just accumulate stuff? Yeah,
and what reward ultimately is there in that? That's the other part of it, is that it's not just Christian people, it's people of the world report. People who have a great wealth and don't know what to do with it. And they report the hollowness and the emptiness of that experience. Like, it's, for what? You know? And so here you have kind of a foundational idea unfolding from Isaiah that don't judge things by their appearance. Because here are these people, they're now leaving. They're not even allowed to take a thing with them. They will have nothing. They will have nothing. But Isaiah describes them as the people of God who are now beginning again to turn and to carry out the mission and the ministry of God in the world. Let's hope, right? I mean, and you can think of them as a whole group, but you know, we look at it as, I would want to know, what were the individuals thinking in this? Were they all on board with this?
Right. I keep thinking also of, I took an online course. There's a Yale professor, I believe her name is Laurie Santos, and she does a class on happiness. And she said all the studies have shown that people who will say they are happy, happiness comes, or they feel happiness, it's not because of what they have, but the experiences that they've had. So it doesn't necessarily mean you need more stuff, but you need to live a life with experiences that made you happy. And it's not material. It's whether it's inspirational, spiritual, mentally exciting, whatever. But that's what she said, that the studies have shown, that's the people that are happiest are because of the experiences they've
And
had.
I think we battle against a daily onslaught that teaches us the exact opposite.
Right,
I mean, I don't know why, but this is the time of year where they're advertising
Right.
a lot of cruises. You know,
right,
and you
right.
see these happy families, right? 2.5 children traveling with a happy dad and a happy mom, and they're sliding down slides, and so they market experience too. But the experiences that they're talking about are experiences you can buy. You know, if we're going to go off to an all-expense retreat somewhere in a place where there are island huts that are built out over the calm, beautiful coral reefs, and I think we are bombarded every day. I get so fatigued because I don't agree. Like, I can watch a commercial like that. I can watch a car commercial. There is a truck commercial that says, a truck is good. A truck is a tool. But then it says, but our truck is life. It actually says that. It says, our truck is life. You know, and I want to go, who is sitting in the room and writing this? Who is, and yet it's proclaimed, like the prophets who talk about God is proclaiming a different truth day and night through the nature and through our lives. They are proclaiming this word over and over and over and over again. A car is a way to enrich your soul. Right? I mean, that's, you know, that new car smell and that experience of the new technology and all, that's life. That's it. And then they show commercials with the cars going over the speed limit, you know, in places where you're not allowed to go at all, the driving Jeeps up mountains. So they are marketing experience, but I don't know how to describe it. It's different than what that woman is talking about.
I'm talking about human relationships and experiences. And that's, you know, what I think of as experiences is something that you talk about all the time. Our relationship to each other, our relationship to God. That the experience is how we relate to others or to God. Not necessarily that we have the super duper car or the McMansion or whatever. You know, that to me is not the experience that she's talking about.
Yeah, like the experience of having enough money to buy your own rocket ship and put yourself,
Or go to Mars
put
or
yourself
wherever
in space right now. There's an experience. I mean, but yeah, so there's a competing, there is a competing idea for happiness. There is a very, very strong competitive, I would call it disinformation about happiness. You know, I accuse the beer commercials, especially during football season, of this. They latch onto what is the truth. And the truth is, you know, you come home from a hard day's work, there's nothing better than having good friends gathered around you that you can have experiences of love and care. You can learn about the other person's experience and see if there's ways you can help them. But the beer commercials, they cut through all of that.
Right.
And the way to be close with your friends is to open a bottle of alcohol, and maybe more than one, and share in the goodness that comes from this drug. And I just find it, I don't know, how will the word of the gospel ever survive in a culture that is so saturated and permeated with what we know isn't the truth? I mean, I know it's not the truth. You know it's not the truth. But we are still affected by it. It's like a wave that pushes us.
We're always telling, I'm always kind of wondering in terms of, is it good that people are out buying stuff? It is, in the sense that means other people have jobs. But what are they buying, and how much debt are they going into? And, there's consequences for everything.
Yeah, and
that's
yes.
what there's got to be some balance, I guess, in terms of, but, what kind of, I was just listening today to NPR, and they were talking about a weatherman who moved from Boston to Iowa. And in Iowa, he was talking about how the weather is affected by climate changes. And he was getting death threats because they don't want that kind of stuff. And he finally decided, he'd had enough. So he's moving back to Boston. And then they talked to someone else, I think it was in Indiana, a woman who had been a scientist, who had been in charge of climate changes or climatology, whatever, in the government. And she said that, that people don't see it as a science. They see it as a political, and they're so anti. She said, I'm not getting anywhere with this. I've tried for 8 years, and maybe someone else has a better, but it's so disappointing.
It is disappointing, and it is, again, I think it comes out of this, we are competing with a macro story. A macro story is, whether you use God or whether you don't, that the secret to a happy life is the accumulation of many things, and somehow if you can accumulate enough things so that those things then lead to the accumulation of more things. And so when we start talking about the limitations of trying to protect the balance of nature or the environment, it sounds like communism in the ears of people. Like you're trying to take control of us. You're trying to deprive us of what God has intended for us to have. And capitalism is driven by consumption. And in order for it to really work, it has to continue to sell its false truth, which is the more you have, then you'll have, and then you'll want more. And wanting more is the key for everybody having more. And the word more becomes the religious mantra. And I can say it. I mean, anybody who knows my life would look at me and go, well, you're a hypocrite. You can talk about it in Bible study, but can you really say that you have found a way of taking a stand that says, I'm not buying into that? And I can't. It's too big. It's too big. I have days where I get discouraged too, and I think the solution to my unhappiness or discouragement is somehow a thing, or I don't know what, but I know it's not true. I know it isn't true, but that doesn't change what the drumbeat that is around. And I think in some ways that's what Babylon represented for the community that was first the followers of Jesus. They had no money, no wealth, they had no power, and yet they had experienced the power of God. They had experienced happiness in a surprising way, and that had come to them not through the ways that the empire promised. And as much as we think the Roman Empire was different than the world we live in today, it's the same principles. Walter Brueggemann talks about this all the time. He just talks about the idea of empire. Empire is the way to happiness. Jesus comes along. He has no possessions. He has nothing to show for anything in his life, 33 years. He has nothing to show except for the the power of his ability to love and care for people who were around him. And people recognized it as the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And they still do. And on certain days, I still do. But the weaponry of advertisement it's powerful. I mean, they study human psychology. They know how we think.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you get these movies that are generated that talk about the machine, the great machine, which is controlling us. And
Right.
But Isaiah says, the time will come where there will be deliverance from this. And the servants of God, although they won't look like much, they will startle nations with their love and their compassion and the power that is generated from them. That's what I hear him saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they will see. They will see. And I think people do see. I don't know, something different, an alternative understanding of what the purpose of life is. Because when you buy into the commercialism and you buy into the capitalism, you will eventually find yourself in those places that humans arrive at, and they say, what is this all about? What have I done that matters?
Is that all there is?
Yeah, that's that song, right? Is that all there is?
Yep.
Well, let's read 53.
Okay.
Since Isaiah's in a good mood and he feels like telling us good
he
things.
wasn't complaining about others this time.
And I want you to keep in mind, now this, Isaiah 53, is probably the most popular looking back reference to Jesus.
Okay.
So, and what frustrates Jewish people is Christians read this and they go, oh, that's Jesus. That's very frustrating to Jewish people. It's so we're not confused. This is not Isaiah predicting the coming of Jesus' suffering.
But the human condition.
Yeah.
I was wondering, how come they're talking about Jesus in the Old Testament?
Yeah, they're not. That's the point.
But the Christian whoever's are often going back and relating to saying, see, they talking about it there. So.
I got that now, but that answers my question.
Yep.
That's very peculiar.
Yeah.
I mean, when if you listen to Handel's Messiah, I mean, think of the name of it. It's Handel's Messiah, so it's an oratorio piece about Jesus, right? But what Handel does is what the church has done. He goes back into the Old Testament and he finds references in the Hebrew scriptures that sound like the story of Jesus' life. And so uneducated Christians will do a Bible study today and say, oh, look, here, Isaiah 53. Here's Isaiah, the prophet, the fortune teller, right? He's telling the future, and he is telling about the coming of Jesus and how God is going. And then, this is why Jewish scholars are so frustrated with Christians, because Christians then, in their around the coffee and the donuts, they will go, how could Jews be so stupid? They rejected Jesus, and there he is, described right in their own scripture. And it just adds to what has many Christian theologians today are trying to fight against anti-Semitism, which is, it was the Jewish people who murdered Jesus, who crucified him. And there's no mention that Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was a Jew. And that Isaiah was not predicting the future. Isaiah is talking about the present time. Babylon has crucified Israel. It's my way of they've crucified Israel. There's nothing left of the people of God who used to proudly walk around the desert and eat manna from the ground and drink water from a rock. There's none of that. They are a shadow of their former selves, abused and beaten into slavery, raped and maimed by Babylon, and they are in really bad shape. And so now Isaiah sees the fall of Babylon. So now the oppressor is falling, and the wounded and the beaten are going to go free. And Isaiah sees God's hand in that. If Christians want to look back and say, oh, well, that sounds a lot like what happened to Jesus, that's fine. But don't make Isaiah, Isaiah never met Jesus, never had any inkling of the story of Jesus. And I'll go to my grave insisting on that. So, all right, so let's read 53 and get ready, because you'll hear an awful lot of Jesus in between the lines.
Who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors.
So you hear any of Jesus' theology in here? You know, people try to understand who Jesus was and what he was and how this is when preachers in certain traditions of Christianity want to tell the story of Jesus' death and resurrection, they go to Isaiah. He bore our sins. He was wounded for our transgressions. He, all of these phrases. And I get choked up sometimes to be able to say, Isaiah had someone, although not one person,
Right.
Isaiah had a group of people in mind that he was talking about. And we may not like it. We may not like the theology that Isaiah unfolds, but Isaiah's idea is that it is possible that the people who have been in captivity in Babylon and have been suffering, and are now, their suffering is coming to an end, that their suffering there's a way in which it can make sense. It can make sense. The previous Isaiah seemed to say it made sense because the people were bad, right? They were bad people. So God punished them. They got invaded. They got taken over by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians. Now, this Isaiah is introducing an idea that in the world in which we live, sometimes, if we are willing, or unwilling even sometimes, to bear up under very difficult and brutal circumstances, our willingness to suffer can produce a benefit of life and health and wealth and forgiveness to other people. That our suffering can be, what's the word I'm looking for? It can produce a vicarious experience. So in Jewish theology, and this theology is very much alive today, that by my willingness to shoulder up under injustice or suffering or pain, by my willingness to do that, the sins of other people can somehow be eradicated. They can be forgiven. That my death doesn't have to be just one person's death. And I think, I don't know if it works exactly, but I go right away to stories of suffering servants that are my contemporaries. I go to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He wasn't a saint, not by any means, but he took on himself a life of enormous suffering. It wasn't just his assassination. He had been beaten, he had been in jail, he took on a quality of suffering, and then ultimately was himself assassinated, and out of his death, now this is where it gets tricky. I don't want to say that he took on himself the consequences of the sins of those who were around him, but I do want to say that. I want to say that his death led to a liberation, not just for the poor people, but his death led to a liberation of many rich people as well, liberated from the dumb ideas they had about what it meant to be a follower of God. So Martin Luther King Jr. is a suffering servant, but he's one person. For Isaiah, the whole nation of Israel, now suffering under the hands of Babylon. Many of them died, many of them did not produce generations beyond, but the generations, they survived. And so the idea is that if you ask in the middle of suffering, why God, why is this happening? Whether we like it or not, Isaiah seems to say they suffered not just for their own sin, their own refusal to live their lives according to the way that Joshua had committed them to, but that they are suffering also to redeem the whole world.
I'm thinking there's a folk song called The Universal Soldier, and who is a soldier? And it goes into they're from every place. I'm thinking this description is of a universal Messiah. That because it goes very much into what I believe is Jesus is not the only Messiah,
Right.
but he got it better than anyone. But that we have had other Messiahs, and that's the way I look at this. You're saying it's a group of people here in terms of Isaiah is not looking at a person, but feeling that this group of people can, as a result of what they have gone through, they can take up for everyone else and make it better for others.
Yeah, and if the behavior of selfish, greedy people pollutes the system of
Right,
humanity, right? This suffering of this group of people can be a salvation. It can be a salvation in of itself. And especially if people see that God is now liberating them, and they're going to go back to farming, and they're going to go back to producing more food than they can consume, and sharing with the world, and being a blessing, that there is a salvation for the world. And I'm just talking right off the front edge of my brain now, but I've been thinking a lot about, you know, the situation in Gaza with Hamas and Israel and all the rest of that. So we have these big people that are the players, right? They're the players, and they're making decisions that are affecting the lives of many, many people. But some of the news stories now are going underneath the big players, and they're introducing you to the little people. They're introducing you to the mother who had a child, and they're talking, and they're describing their suffering, and it's not suffering that makes sense to them. It's not like, you know, they're not warriors for Hamas or warriors for the Israeli nation or any of that. They're just people. They literally are just people who are caught in the middle of this and whose suffering is profound. And yet, I don't know if they're sorting them out this way, but when I listen to their description of where they are and how they often recount the things they're very grateful for today. You know, they also talk about the hope of the suffering to come to an end. There's not a lot of hatred or vitriol that is included in how they are describing. And I think that's what Isaiah is talking about. That the people who are going to change the world, the people who are going to ultimately save the world, will have a Messiah-like appearance. And we know Messiah being, if you're Christian, you think of Jesus as at least one Messiah, that Jesus' way to salvation was not, it was still the way of blessing. You know, he turns to the criminal next to him and says, you know, come on, come with me to paradise. You know, there's a very alternative way of living in this world, and it's almost living underneath the big decision makers and the big governments and everything else, and then there's just the whole population of human beings. And they're running and looking for refuge. They're leaving behind all the things and gathering up. One woman today was describing, they were in northern Gaza, and they were trying to go to southern Gaza. They were trying to obey the command to leave. And she said, so we looked at each other, and we gave long gazes at each other, knowing this may be the last time we see each other. Then she said an interesting thing. She said, we went through the house and we picked up the most expensive and lightest things. And I thought that makes sense, right?
Right.
Because you look for the things that... I can't even imagine it.
To leave everything like that.
And so Isaiah here is introducing the idea that when you're trying to make sense out of the world, and you're trying to make sense out of suffering in the world, and you're trying to say, where is this God who created the whole world and all the rest of that, to remember that God's power isn't always manifested or seen in the way that you might think. That sometimes in the human connections, this is like what you were talking about before, Barbara, in the experiences, in the human connections, there is liberation and salvation for human beings. Even in the worst, when I was a philosophy major, the first book in philosophy is Viktor Frankl's book, The Man's Search for Meaning. And it's the story of a man who is looking for some depth of meaning, and he is suffering in the concentration camp. And it's a profound book that says, underneath all of the trappings of life and all the things that you get sold as how to find a meaningful life and how to live a life of importance, have you ever read it? It's a profound little book. It's a little paperback book, and it's Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And it's just true. It's a truth that comes out of his own incredible suffering in the concentration camps. And his conversations with people he met in the concentration camps, and asking them, how are you surviving? How are you?
Right.
And it's quite revealing, a little bit like what Isaiah is saying. These words remind me of that. Where is it now? When he says, there were many who were astonished because his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told them, they shall see. And I think, to me, what's going on there is that you'd be really surprised by who and how and where are the most meaningful experiences of life.
I keep thinking now of people who are on pilgrimage, because I have a friend whose niece has spent the last 10 years, I'd say, on which she considers pilgrimage. And she was someone who worked for the EPA. She had a job cleaning up sites, and all of a sudden she just travels from one place to the other, does not have a job, and I guess you beg for food.
I'm not
how do
sure.
You live? I don't know. I'm not quite sure. I think her mother pays for her airfare to wherever she goes. But then I don't know if there's a series of places that you know about, like hostels, and there might be a series, but I'm thinking, I am judging it as what a waste of life.
Yeah.
But is she touching people? Is she relating to people? Is she, in her conversations with people, making their life more meaningful? There's another person that I was watching something about philanthropy and fundraising, and the person says that they go a month's pilgrimage every year. And this is a person who's very involved in both fundraising and philanthropy, and they find that energizing. So, I'm not quite sure, but or the nuns the Carmelite nuns, or I guess they're still monks, who live in a silent situation where they never leave. They feel that prayer is the way. And who am I to judge whose life is meaningful?
Yeah, and I don't. I don't know. I think about the Carmelite nuns. They give themselves to the security of the institution that will care for them. They'll always have food. They'll have a place to live, and then they're freed up from the worries of life.
Right.
To do what?
Right.
I mean, I don't know, if you get taken out of the worries of life, isn't that? I don't know. As you were talking, you reminded me, I served in the Bound Brook Presbyterian Church for 10 years. And there was this man, his name was Neil. And I met him the first year I was in that church, and he came in, he had a big bushy burly beard. Usually he had not showered in weeks, and he'd been out in the sun, and his clothes were all worn and tattered. And he had a shoulder pack that he would carry. It was all ripped. And Neil would come to the door of the church. And when he first came, the secretary said to me, there's a man here to see, his name is Neil. And she grew up in a church, so she knew him. Mm-hmm. And so Neil came in, and he sat down, and he introduced himself to me. And he was looking for a night's stay. He wanted to see if I could put him up in a hotel so he could shower and get something to eat. And I found when he traveled, he carried a book, usually a book of philosophy. And whenever he was in the park, he would read. He was a very, very well-read man. Now, I don't know, but he would travel, he had a route that he worked, and he always knew where the churches were, who knew him and who would give him sanctuary and let him stay without beating him up. And the church I was serving had been one of those places. So he arrived there in his pilgrimage. And then I learned, his pilgrimage was he would wander north when the weather was accommodating. So he would go up, he loved to go up into the mountains, and he would go all the way up into New England, usually walking. But sometimes someone will give him a train pass and ask him where he was going. But he had families who knew him and would take him in for a night's sleep. He had congregations, a lot of congregations. And he knew where they were. He didn't have a map, but in his head, he knew where he would find a welcome and hospitality. And so I would sit, I was fascinated by the man. I would sit and talk with him for hours. And he was very articulate, and he was very smart. And he had a memory, like he would arrive at a certain time of year, and he would be sitting in my office, and there was a financial secretary there. I remember the one time she walked in, and he looked up at her and said, "Oh, by the way, happy birthday." Oh, wow. He knew details like that. Jeez. And so, I don't know, I tried to get more involved with him and tried to say, Neil, you're getting old. You're not going to be able to keep doing this. And he just said, well, this is my life. And I wonder, I wonder about his life. I wonder, he threw off all the shackles of life. And so I wrote about him in a newsletter, monthly newsletter. I wrote about my experience with Neil. And I wrote at the end a little bit of reflection, said, I don't really know, I don't know what this suggests. What does Neil need? And someone wrote back anonymously, slipped it under my door, and said, Neil needs to get a job. It's like...
it's so easy to put our values on others. And, but as I said, who am I to judge what is a meaningful life? I think in terms of I need to be functional, but there are a lot of people who still want to live even though they're not functioning in the way that I would want to function. Do I want to say to them, forget about it and, stop eating, or,
give it up.
I'm not going to I can't judge someone else, and who's to say what is the best way to live other than to follow what God's words to us are. But,
especially if you think Isaiah says that suffering, right? It's hard in the world we live in today, where we do everything to avoid suffering.
Right. Yeah,
but Isaiah says that suffering can be, I don't know what other word to use except salvific. Suffering can be a means of salvation the world, the embracing of that suffering. And I think that's a little bit of what's underneath the environmental movement. You know, in order for the environmental movement to really have significant effect on the global warming, we will have to embrace some level of individual suffering. Now that might, I'm not talking about graphic suffering, but I'm talking about being able to see what we could be doing and instead to back away from it a little bit for the good of the earth. You know, to maybe not have.
But until that happens to each individual, are they going to wake up and, you know, and I'm as guilty as others.
Yeah, that's why I say.
Bottled water.
People say the hypocrite. Like, do you remember, because of Rosalind Carter's funeral yesterday, I've been doing a trip back in time. And you remember when Jimmy Carter was president, was when the fuel shortage was there. And he went on national television and appealed to people not to put up the Christmas lights. And to save energy. Remember that?
Right.
And he received so much abuse. But you know what? People did it.
Yeah.
They did it. It was dark at Christmas time, and we did not. Now, I think in some ways that led to some of the skepticism that people have today about the truth of the shortage of resources. Because in the end, my grandfather, he told me all the time, he's like, don't believe that garbage. He goes, the fuel shortage is human invented. And it's, you know, this was when OPEC was being formed, and that there's no, and he said, the supply of oil under the surface of the earth is mind-blowingly large. It's as big as the ocean. There's no shortage of oil.
But what are the effects of that?
I know, that's the other part.
It's not just that we don't have enough of it.
Yeah, but we didn't have that element of it yet in our lives to realize that burning of fossil fuels is creating a gas that is killing us and is creating the loss of our atmosphere. Now, can we believe that? I think there's a lot of people of my grandfather's generation who would say, oh, it's just another thing, you know. The earth will recover, you know, the earth is enormously resourceful. And then on NPR yesterday, I was listening that there's a certain kind of rhino. They were celebrating yesterday the birth of a new, one male rhino was born, and what that means in terms of the possibility of saving this kind of rhino from complete extinction on the earth. And I think, wow, okay. Are we going to believe any of this stuff? Or are we going to turn around and wait and go, where are all the animals? Where are all the birds? I don't know. All right, well, this was good. We got to Isaiah 53. And for those of
he
you,
also wasn't quite as negative.
No, he's not. He's changed his mind that suffering isn't now just a sign of God's punishment. Suffering can be our way. Let's bear it righteously. I'll say goodbye then to those of you online who watch online, and we'll see you next week. Turn this off.
Who's in here?